Yes, I told you you could be in it. Just hang out. Just hold your stuff, stand over there. We'll get to you, I promise. It's not gonna run long like last time. He just cut me some slack. It's gonna be fine. It's Friday. Hey you guys, welcome to the show. It is Slacker Friday, and today we're gonna talk about aperture and ISO and shutter speed and just what it takes to get the perfect exposure. All right, so moment of truth. I've recorded this next section about 400 times, and every time I get tongue-tied or I get moving too fast, and I just blow it. So no matter what happens, we're just gonna keep going this time. All right, so let's talk about what it takes at a very basic level for light outside in your scene to move through your camera and finally get to the sensor to be recorded as an image. And for our purposes, we're gonna break that into 3 distinct stages that will relate to the 3 different pieces that go into making the perfect exposure. So the first piece here is our lens. And as light comes through our lens, it is going to pass through a mechanism called the aperture ring. Now the aperture ring works a lot like the iris of your eye. It can contract and expand to let more or less light come through. So for our purposes, the aperture is going to deal with the volume of light that we're letting through, whether we're letting in a little bit flow of light or a big dump of light. That's what the aperture's job is. Now after the aperture, we pass through the shutter. And the shutter's job is about speed. How long are we going to let the light that the aperture is letting through pass through to the sensor? So if it's a long exposure, maybe we're letting that stay open for 30 seconds. If it's a short exposure, maybe it's a 4,000th of a second. But the shutter is all about time. So volume of light, how long we're letting that light come through, and then finally our sensor. And our sensor deals with how sensitive that digital piece of whatever it is going to record that light. So in the olden days, we had ISO for film, and that ISO told us if it's a very small number, 100, 50, whatever, that it was going to be not very sensitive to light, that you were going to have to let light shine on that for a long time in order for that film to be properly exposed. Whereas if you had a 400, an 800, or a 1600 speed film, that film and the chemical makeup of that film allowed light to be absorbed a lot faster, so you could have a lot faster shutter speed for capturing action or fast moving things that we wanted to freeze the frame on. So that's kind of where ISO comes from, and that's been translated to this digital sensor, and so we can adjust how sensitive that sensor is to that light. So those are our 3 pieces: how much light we're going to let through, how much time we're going to let it through for, and how sensitive we're going to be to the light that's coming through. Oh my gosh, I made it all the way through. All the way through. All right, so now that we know the 3 ingredients that go into making our perfect exposure, or any exposure, let's go ahead and see how mixing and matching them can give us different results in our final image. So let's go ahead and look at this graph for a minute, and let's say that this equals our perfect exposure. In other words, we've captured as much information as we can. We haven't blown out the image and overexposed and lost our highlights. We haven't underexposed and lost our shadows. For our example here, this is just the perfect exposure for the scene that we're looking at. All right, now, we have ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, our 3 ingredients, and what we're going to do is we're going to mix and match these, but as long as the mixture equals 100% of our little graph, we're going to wind up with a good exposure. In other words, an exposure that is perfectly exposed. Now, if for instance, I were to shrink the ISO down, but not adjust aperture and shutter speed, well, I'm going to end up underexposed, right? Because I haven't compensated for the change in that block. Same thing goes the other way. If I expand my ISO, but I don't adjust aperture and shutter speed, I'm going to end up overexposed. So as we work through our photograph, we want to make sure that if we change one thing, we're compensating in other ways in order to make sure that we're still landing in that 100% zone. Make sense? So let's go grab the camera and set up a scene and play with these ingredients a little bit and see how mixing and matching in different ways can give us different results. Yeah, I know, it's your, yes, it's your, you want to come? All right. Well, come over here. All right, our model for today is Norm, and the G is silent. Anyway, Norm will be modeling for us. We're going to set up a little scene controlled here in the house so I can sort of show you how mixing and matching our ingredients gives us completely different results. Here we are looking at the back of the camera. I have Norm standing against a very neutral background so we can play around with this exposure and not be distracted by anything else. So if he'll just hold still for a few minutes so we can get this done, I'd really appreciate it. All right, so the first thing I want to call your attention to is that long light meter up there on the right-hand side of my screen. Now that meter is telling me what the camera believes to be the correct exposure for this scene, and we're going to assume that it's pretty close to right. If we look at the histogram there next to it, we can see that all of the tonal information for this shot is right in the middle of the histogram. We're not too far to the right or too far to the left. We're not clipping anything off on at edges. So we can assume this is a good exposure. So let's just go ahead and take a picture here. All right, now let's start messing with things. And the first thing I want to change is the f-stop. And let's take the f-stop from an f1.8 and let's just roll it up to maybe, let's say f8. Now we've completely lost all our information. You can see that the histogram has gone way off the left-hand side and our light meter is saying, no way, you're way underexposed. So the next thing we need to do is adjust our shutter speed. So let's just go ahead and give ourselves a little more time on the shutter there. And again, here we are, f8, but we have a balanced exposure. Our light meter is right at 0. Our histogram looks great. So let's just go ahead and take that picture. All right, well that worked well. What if we crank that f all the way up to 22? That's as small as the aperture will go in this lens. Well, if we jump that shutter speed down a little further, now look, we've got to shoot for 3 seconds to get the same exposure. 1, 2, 3, and there it is. And you can see now, if I scroll through these images, there's not a whole lot of difference. We basically have the same exposure through all 3 of these pictures. So why, Drew, you might be asking, if we can create the exact same exposure with 3 different versions of this recipe, why would we want to do that? Well, first of all, what you're not seeing, because Norm is standing still and we have nothing else going on in the scene, that we can do a lot of things by being able to manipulate the exposure this way. For instance, let's say that you're taking a picture of a waterfall. If we use the first situation where we had the shutter wide open and a really fast shutter speed, that water would be still. It wouldn't be smooth, it would just be the waterfall. Now, if we went all the way to the f22 version at the end and we left that shutter open for a full 2 seconds, we would have those beautiful smooth waterfalls that you like to see. Now, both are a correct exposure, but the amount of time that we let the light come through the shutter is really what made the difference between one shot just being ordinary and one shot being a gorgeous waterfall, right? The other reason we might want to do this is for depth of field, and we'll look at that next. All right, for our second location, I have Norm standing here on the stairs. The reason I like these stairs is because we have this nice series of posts extending out into the distance behind him, as well as some further distance things with the dining room table back there. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna see what difference changing our f-stop makes on our actual depth of field. So here we are, we're still on ISO 64. I'm gonna leave that there, and we're just gonna play with shutter speed and aperture. Now, the aperture right now is at 1.8, which is as big as this lens can go. It's just as wide open, as much light as possibly can come through there is coming through. And so we're gonna go ahead and just take a picture right here. And we can see on the right-hand side, we have our meter that's showing that we are zeroed out, so it's a perfectly correct exposure, and then that's confirmed by the histogram there in the right-hand corner, where we can see that we don't have anything pushing all the way into the blacks, and we're not clipping any of the highlights into the right. So for all intents and purposes, a perfect exposure. All right, now let's change that f-stop and let's roll that up to maybe f8. Really cut the light down. So now what we've done is we've reduced the size of that opening, and now we need to give ourselves more time so that more light can get in to get the same exposure. So let's go ahead and change that f-stop and just wind that up until once again our meter says 0. So again, meter says 0 here. You can see that the histogram has changed a little bit, and that's because we have more things in focus in the background, and so we've got more tonal range to deal with. But we still have a perfect exposure. Our meter is still at 0, and you can see that our depth of field is already starting to extend into some of those posts behind Norm. So let's go ahead and take this picture. All right, and then one last time, let's roll that f-stop all the way down. Let's just get it all the way to 22, which is as small of a hole as we can get out of this lens. And then let's make our correction with our shutter speed. And it looks like 2 seconds is what we're going to need for this picture to also be a perfect exposure. So let's go ahead and take that. Great. Now let's go ahead and look at those back to back. First, f1.8, then f8, then f22. So are you starting to get it? You're starting to understand why, even though we can expose exactly the same at 3 completely different settings, what we use those for can be completely different. So for instance, this f1.8 shot would be way better for a portrait, whereas our f22 shot would be way better for a landscape, because we've got a shallow depth of field versus a deep depth of field. Anyway, I hope that demonstrates a little bit about how aperture and shutter speed and ISO all work together to create the ideal exposure. And as you go out and compose pictures, as you're working on projects and trying to envision images, try and think about these things and make those decisions consciously about how you're going to shoot that exposure to get the most out of the picture. Anyway, I think that's it for me today, guys. I'm gonna go enjoy the rest of my Friday. Have a good one. See you next time.